Amen. So you're there in Judges chapter 14, and last week we started. Basically, I started a little series here, the life of Samson. And so last week we were really covering the birth of Samson, so more so dealing with Samson's parents and how the angel came to his mother, and then obviously his father also Manoah saw the angel as well. Here we're really getting into the story of Samson. And in this passage here in chapter 14, we get a story where Samson actually marries a Philistine woman. And so I think, I know when I first got saved, you hear these stories like Samson, Delilah, Jonah and the whale, and all these different ones. And I remember looking for the story of Samson and Delilah, and I'm reading through Samson, and I'm like, I didn't know he had a wife, because you always hear, I think even like, if you ever watched a movie about Samson, it's like always about Samson and Delilah, right? But that actually doesn't happen until chapter 16 with Samson and Delilah. So he actually is married. He gets married in this passage. But there's definitely some interesting stuff that happens here. But first of all, in chapter 14, in verse 1 here, obviously we're fast-forwarding from his birth to this story. But at the end of chapter 13, you do see that the Spirit of the Lord began to move him at times in the camp. So we don't really know. We don't get all that information as far as what was the Spirit of the Lord doing with him during the time. But again, if you remember, Samson is the Spirit of the Lord is said to come upon him more than anybody else in the Bible. And so that's a very interesting bit of information there. But in verse 1 here, it says, "And Samson went down to Timnath and saw a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. And he came up and told his father and his mother and said, I have seen a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. Now, therefore, get her for me to wife." So this is obviously a strange request because Samson is of the tribe of Dan specifically, but he's of Israel. And the idea of him wanting to marry someone of the Philistines is obviously not supposed to be happening. This gets into not being equally yoked. And when it talks about marrying other people from other strange, having strange wives, if you will, is the idea that they don't believe in the same God, and so we are not to be yoked with unbelievers. But we see here that in verse 2, his parents are going to be obviously complaining about this, but it says in verse 2 there, it says, verse 3, it says, "Then his father and his mother said unto him, Is there never a woman among the daughters of thy brethren, or among all my people, that thou goest to take a wife of the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said unto his father, Get her for me, for she pleaseth me well." So again, it gets into that idea of they're uncircumcised. Now, obviously, you have the outward expression of uncircumcision, but more importantly, the idea that they're uncircumcised in heart. The idea of what that physical circumcision represents there. But in verse 4 there, it says, "But his father and his mother knew not that it was of the Lord." Okay, so I do believe that this was of the Lord. This was something that the Lord was going to use to obviously afflict the Philistines. Because notice it says that he sought an occasion against the Philistines, for at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel. So a lot of information here, but we already know actually from the passage before that they are basically, in the book of Judges in general, there's always a time of rest, and then there's a time of them being, basically being ruled over by the Philistines or some other nation, and it's kind of this back and forth. But at the time, the Philistines basically had dominion over the Israelites, and Samson is seeking out occasion against them, and it says that this is of the Lord. So this isn't the only place where someone is marrying, where a prophet or, in this case, a deliverer or a judge is marrying someone that's kind of like out of left field as far as what is normally done. Go to Hosea chapter 1. Hosea chapter 1. So Hosea the prophet. Hosea 1 and verse 2. Hosea 1 and verse 2 says, "The beginning of the word of the Lord by Hosea, And the Lord said to Hosea, Go, take unto thee a wife of whoredoms and children of whoredoms, for the land hath committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and which conceived and bare him a son. So, if you know, especially when you look at the priests in the Old Testament, they had certain stipulations as far as who they are to marry, right? They're not to marry someone divorced. They're not to marry someone that's obviously of another nation. They're not to marry a whore. Essentially, like that's what the Bible teaches. And listen, when it comes to stipulations I put for like my daughter's getting married or my son's getting married is the idea that I want them to marry believers. I want that, and not just a believer, but I want them to marry a believer that loves the Lord and that I believe is going to be a good spouse for them. But this idea that it's not that you couldn't marry somebody that is an unbeliever and get them saved and stuff like that, but it's not ideal. And then you're taking this big gamble that they're, it's not like that's not really marriage. Like you get married and it's like, well, you're not really married because I'm not a believer. The idea here is that ideal situation is that you marry somebody and you're both pure, going to the altar, that you're saved, you love the Lord, like all these things are in place. And so obviously, I don't believe it's a sin to marry, like for Hosea, for example, to marry this woman that's of whoredoms. But man, you're marrying someone with a lot of baggage, right? And you're going to have probably problems in your marriage. In the end, that was used for a sign. If you read the book of Hosea, when basically their children, the names of their children, like all of that as far as like what it all represents. So it's interesting that this would be of the Lord, that Samson would marry this Philistine woman. So but it's also just interesting too that he comes back and just like, get her for me to wife. I found this woman, I want her to wife, get her for me to wife. And it is interesting too, the wordage, the verbiage there, as far as the idea is there never a woman among the daughters of thy brethren? It almost sounds like they've been really trying to set up Samson with like people in that are among them, and he's just like, is there just no one that you're interested in that's of our brethren that's around here? You're gonna go find this Philistine. But in verse 5 here, then went Samson down and his father and his mother to Timnath, and came to the vineyards of Timnath, and behold, a young lion roared against him. So they're all going down to Timnath, but I believe that Samson obviously is alone when this lion comes at him and starts roaring against him. And notice this in verse 6, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and he rent him as he would have rent a kid, and he had nothing in his hand, but he told not his father or his mother what he had done. So what does rent mean, right? So, obviously kids are probably listening and be like, is he renting an apartment? Like, what's going on here? Well, in the Bible, rent means to basically tear something, okay? A big example of this is like Job rent his mantle. And you're like, what does mantle mean, right? But basically, like, it's kind of like the portion right here, you kind of think this as being kind of like a mantle a little bit, but the idea of like the garment that's up here, you're renting that. And obviously, they would rent that to show sorrow and distress and all that. But renting just means to rip something in half. Like the veil was rent from the top to the bottom, right? When Jesus died, the veil that was in the temple was rent from the top to the bottom, which means that it was ripped, okay? So he literally rips this lion apart. Now that's a whole nother idea of strength. Obviously, you think about the story of David where he says he took him by the beard and smote him. Now, we don't really know how he killed the lion, how David killed the lion. It doesn't say that David didn't have anything in his hand, though. Samson, it says he had nothing in his hand. So it's very descriptive to say, like, he didn't have any weapon. It's not like, well, he rent him in two with a sword. Now, what I picture happened, and obviously, too, it not only says that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, it says it mightily came upon him, right? But he literally took the lion and ripped it in half. That's intense. Now, like I said, when you think of Samson, what do you picture in your mind? What does he look like? Does he look like the Hulk, not green? Or does he look like a normal man? Now, obviously, I don't believe he looked like, like some skinny, like lanky-looking guy. I think he looked like a normal kind of guy. As far as just a normal, I'm sure he just looked like a normal guy. He's probably fit, but he doesn't look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Of course, you're like, he's, 75, so, get someone that's more up to date, okay? That's my 90s, like, childhood coming back to me here. But you get the point. I believe the thing is that he was a normal, as far as strength goes, I don't think there was anything like just standing out as him looking like someone that's just really big. Like he's Goliath or something like that, okay? And so the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him. So this is, when you think about the idea, I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me, or when I am weak, then am I strong in Christ. Obviously, when we're talking about that, we're usually talking about spiritually speaking. Here we're talking about actual physical strength. And he rips this lion in half, it doesn't say in half, but basically he rents this lion. And it says that he has nothing in his hand. So basically, then he does not tell his parents about this. He doesn't tell them about, the fact that he killed this lion, which also tells you something about Samson. He wasn't, who here, if they ripped a lion in half, would not tell that story?
I would not tell that story.
Yeah, well, the thing is, like, I don't think any guy in here would not say that. Like, hey, listen, I was out. Like, if you went out soul winning today, would you, and you had to, like, kill a lion, who here would not tell that story? Like, we would all tell that story. So the idea that he doesn't tell his parents this, really, it tells you something about Samson. I don't believe that Samson is a guy that is trying to get clout or trying to get fame or trying to, tell people, like show people like who he is and the fact that look how spiritual I am because I rent this lion. He just rents the lion and goes about his business. This is obviously a physical feat, but I think that it is something to be said about the idea of spirituality and the idea that we need to, obviously, we want to do great things for God, but we should not be trying to broadcast the great things, like we have to have this megaphone on everything that we do and every feat that we make, we got to, like, announce it to the world. And so that's just something that I just see there when it comes to Samson. Going on down the line here, notice the thing to think about with this too. Go to Proverbs chapter 30. Proverbs chapter 30, specifically with lions here. I know that there's this whole debate as far as whether 100 men could take out a gorilla. But I want you to think about this. I do believe a lion, notice what it says here in Proverbs chapter 30, verse 29. Everybody's going to be looking up on YouTube, gorilla versus lion, like which one's stronger, It's like the bear versus the lion, everything. Verse 29, it says, there be three things which go well, yea, four are comely in going. A lion which is strongest among beasts, and turneth not away for any, a greyhound, and he-goat also, and a king, against whom there is no rising up. So it gives these different examples as far as what's comely. But a lion which is strongest among beasts. So just the idea here of what he's coming up against when it comes to a lion. You say, well, it was a young lion. It wasn't like Mufasa. It was Simba, It's like, I don't care which of the family tree of the lion that's coming at you. I don't care if it's Nala coming after you. You're like, how do you know all these names? My daughter's really obsessed with lions right now. So, but anyway, it's interesting too because I just preached a sermon about Daniel in the den of lions, and now we're talking about lions again. But this idea of it being strongest among beasts and just that how much strength it took to take the strongest among beasts. And you say, well, how is he strongest among beasts? Wouldn't this have more strength and, all this other stuff? I think pound for pound what we're talking about here. If you're talking about a UFC fight and you said, who's the best fighter? Who's the strongest fighter out there? It may not necessarily be the heaviest guy that's out there, right? Or the strongest guy that's out there. Pound for pound, I believe the lion is the strongest beast that's out there. That's what I personally believe when it comes to why this is true. And you say, well, is a gorilla stronger? I would say pound for pound, a lion is stronger than a gorilla. Now, as far as who would win in a battle, I think that, time and chance happen to every animal. I don't know, who knows? When it comes to that, as far as who would win. Go to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. The other thing to think about with this, too, is that Samson is in the Hall of Faith. The Hall of Faith meaning Hebrews chapter 11 gives a whole list of different men and women that served the Lord and walked in faith and did great things for God. And Samson is mentioned, and really he's kind of mentioned here with a whole group of different people, and then it gives a list of different things here. But I want you to see that there's definitely things in here that would fit Samson's life. And some we're not getting to tonight, some we are, but in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32, it says, "And what shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and of Barak and of Samson and of Jephthah." Notice that he's kind of going through all these different judges, right? So Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, these are all judges. Maybe not in order as far as they're mentioned in the book of Judges, but you see all that. Then it goes of David also and Samuel and of the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises. Notice this, stopped the mouths of lions. Now, you can definitely see how that would apply to Daniel. But I would say he stopped the mouth of that lion. I mean, he rent it. It's definitely not biting him after that. Quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. Out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight. This is something that you could obviously attest to Samson, but more so probably in the next chapter when you get into what he does when the Philistines are coming after him and the idea of waxing valiant in fight, turning to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings. At the end of Samson's life, his eyes were put out, and he is basically put into basically mocked in front of all the Philistines, right? And so he was grinding, and, basically at the grinding mill and all this stuff, and then basically brought out to make sport with him and to make fun of him and to mock him, right? And he ends up, spoiler alert, but he ends up dying in the end. So, spoiler alert, everybody in Judges is dead right now because people don't live that long. But it says, "Yea, moreover, of bonds and imprisonment, they were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth." And there's definitely a lot in there that can definitely apply to Samson's life as we go through his life and his story here in Judges. And Judges 13, 14, 15, and 16, those are the chapters we have for Samson. So there's not a lot of information about Samson, but there's really cool stories that we're dealing with here when it comes to that. So we see here kind of the first feat from Samson is killing a lion with his bare hands. And so definitely wouldn't want to mess with Samson. Judges chapter 14 and verse 7, it says, "And he went down and talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson well." So this is kind of almost a side note, right? They're going down to get this woman to marry Samson. And as they're going down to Timnath, Samson this lion comes at him, and he rents it and kills it, doesn't tell anybody about it. And then it kind of proceeds with the story that he goes to talk to this woman. And obviously he likes her. Verse 8, it says, and after a time he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. Behold, there was a swarm of bees and honey in the carcass of the lion. Now, when it says after a time, this is interesting. I actually should have consulted my older brother on this because he's into honey and bees and all this stuff. But I was just kind of looking up how much time it takes to basically make honey. Okay, to the point where you'd actually be eating it. And it doesn't take long for bees to start making a hive, that's for sure. Brother Joseph gets all these hives and stuff like that. He sets it out in his 3-stall carport. And basically come back from doing something out on the farm or whatever, and then there's already bees making a hive in there. But the idea of like honey, that takes a little bit of time, right? They have to pollinate, they have to do all these different things to actually make honey. So I do believe that there is a certain amount of time. I think I looked up, it was like 45 days or something like that as far as how long it takes from the process of like the bees going out, getting everything, coming back, and making the honey and everything. But there's some time that goes on there, right? So he kills this lion, and it's a carcass of a lion. So I don't believe it's like, it could very well be that you're just dealing with like basically the bone structure that's there, maybe the rib cage or whatever that's there. So one, it tells you that there's some time that has taken place from when he went down there to begin with and met with this woman to when he's coming back and actually marrying her. In verse 8 it says, and after a time he returned, there was a swarm of bees, honey in the carcass of the lion. Verse 9, it says, and he took thereof in his hands and went on eating and came to his father and mother, and he gave them, and they did eat. But he told not them that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of the lion. It's very interesting, right? You're just like, why doesn't he tell them about the lion? Why doesn't he tell like where this honey came from? But I think the point of the matter is he's going to tell a riddle about this later on, and no one knows about this but him, right? That basically he got this honey from the carcass of a lion. And so it's kind of like his own little thing that he's seen, but probably most other people have not seen this as far as that's concerned. Now, spiritually speaking, as far as like I don't believe anything is in the Bible just incidentally, right? That we see this story, and it's not just so that there's this riddle. You could make that case that, well, this story was told to us so that when he tells this riddle, it's going to make sense. Because if he just told the story about the riddle and you didn't know the backstory about what happened, then it wouldn't make sense. But the idea of finding honey in the carcass of a lion, I was just thinking about this when it comes to, obviously honey in the Bible, in a lot of cases is likened unto the Word of God or knowledge, wisdom, that type of thing. Go to Proverbs chapter 24. Proverbs chapter 24 and verse 13. Proverbs chapter 24 and verse 13. It says, my son, eat thou honey because it is good, and the honeycomb which is sweet to thy taste. Now, you could say, well, we're specifically talking about honey, actual physical honey, and that would be true, which is showing you that honey is good. Obviously it's not bad for you. Too much honey, though, will make you vomit, as it says in Proverbs, so you got to be careful. But in verse 14 it says, so shall the knowledge of wisdom be unto thy soul. So notice that it's just as much as honey is good and it's sweet to the taste, so shall the knowledge of wisdom be unto thy soul. When thou hast found it, then there shall be a reward, and thy expectation shall not be cut off. And the idea of finding knowledge, and I think that it's very interesting that it's found in a lion, because the lion is the strongest among beasts. And when he gives this riddle of out of the eater came forth meat, and out of the strong came forth sweetness, is this idea of strong meat with honey. And I think about what it says go to Hebrews chapter 5, on this idea of the meat of the word, or this idea of the strong meat that's there. And I believe this is a concept in the Bible that the more you do the work the more you're going to be able to handle the strong meat of the word. The idea of, he that winneth souls is wise, right? The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and he that winneth souls is wise. The idea there of the wisdom that God gives and the understanding of strong meat being given when you do the work. And I think about the idea that the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him to where he does this great feat. Now it's physically speaking, right? This is all physical. He literally had honey. He's literally eating honey. He literally killed a lion. But think about this in a spiritual sense, that if you accomplish a great feat in the Lord, that I do believe that there will be honey, like meat of the word, that God will help you understand. And what I want to say with this, notice what it says in Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 12. It says, for the time ye ought to be teachers, ye have need that one teach you again, which be the first principles of the oracles of God, and are become such as have need of milk and not of strong meat. Basically saying, you ought to know better. You ought to know these first principles, but you need milk. You can't handle the strong meat of the word. In verse 13 it says, for everyone that uses milk is unskillful in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But strong meat belongeth to them that are of full age. So basically saying, if you can't handle strong meat, then you're just a babe in Christ. If you can handle strong meat, then you're a full age. You're mature, right? You can handle that. But here's how you can handle the strong meat. It says, even those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. When it comes to the book of Proverbs, the first thing that's mentioned in Proverbs chapter 1 is the idea of getting knowledge and wisdom to be able to discern and be able to understand the proverbs and the dark sayings. Because when you think about the meat of the word, what are we talking about? We're talking about things that aren't super clear. They're not just something that is just simple to understand necessarily. It is deep doctrine. It is things that are more complex and that you need to really have a lot of understanding of the whole Bible to grasp. But I think the point that needs to be made here is that strong meat, understanding strong meat is not just studying more. Okay? To understand more about the Bible, it's not, obviously you need to study. You need to give attendance to reading. You need to obviously study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Don't take that out of the equation. But the idea of doing the work and doing the great feats of God, through the Spirit, that is something that I believe that God rewards with knowledge and wisdom. So the idea of the fruit of the righteous is the tree of life, and he that winneth souls is wise. Well, he that winneth his souls is wise because I believe God rewards obedient, those that are obedient to his commandments with more wisdom, more knowledge, and I believe rewards those with be able to handle the strong meat. So like I said, when he comes to the riddle, the riddle is out of the eater came forth meat, and out of the strong came forth sweetness. This idea of doing the work and having this, walking in the Spirit, being filled with the Spirit, and that is something that you have to purge sin out of your life to do. You have to, obviously, love the Lord and to keep his commandments, all these things that take place there. But that there is a reward for that, right? Like it says, there shall be a reward. When thou hast found it, there shall be a reward. The reward, I believe, of knowledge and wisdom when you do the work. And so this comes into the idea that there are a lot of people that do a lot of study when it comes to the Word of God, but I believe because they don't do the work, that's why they don't have the wisdom. They may have a lot of knowledge, but there's a difference between knowledge and understanding, and there's a difference between knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. And so you can know a lot of things, but do you understand what you know? And wisdom, I believe, is applying the knowledge you understand, like actually applying it correctly. And this isn't a sermon on wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, but going back to Judges chapter 14, so he gives it, it's interesting too because he eats it, but then he gives it to his family as well. And, that's something too to think about, when it comes to let's say I'm reading through the Bible and I'm understanding maybe some dark saying or some parable or something like that, and I'm coming to terms with what this means, is the idea of being able to share that with others. And that's also biblical in the idea of teaching others, that people would learn so that they would be able to teach others, right? And isn't that kind of the Great Commission? I mean, on a very just easy level there, you go out and preach the gospel, and then the person gets saved, they get baptized, and then you teach them to observe all things whatsoever commanded you. Meaning the idea is like, then they start doing it. And so, Judges chapter 14 and verse 10 here, so we see that, okay, Samson is going down to Timnath. He wants this woman that's of Timnath to marry. As he goes down there with his parents, he's apparently not with his parents at the time that this lion comes at him. He rents it, kills it, comes back, and there's obviously a space of time there that takes place. Could be a month, I don't know, something like that. So where he comes back and there's honey found, he takes it, eats it, gives it to his parents to eat, but doesn't tell anybody about the whole situation. So in Judges chapter 14 and verse 10, it says, "So his father went down unto the woman, and Samson made there a feast, for so used the young men to do. And it came to pass, when they saw him, that they brought 30 companions to be with him." So the Philistines, basically, he makes this, so Samson has this feast, it's a 7-day feast, and then he has these companions, the Philistines, I believe, bring these 30 companions to be with him. Later on, we see that he uses one of those companions as a friend. The whole situation's interesting, as far as this idea of like, I don't know if this is wedding party, it's kind of like they just supplied these guys to be like, hey, they're going to be with you, and maybe that's a whole part of the whole wedding thing. But verse 12 there says, "And Samson said unto them, I will now put forth a riddle unto you." So if you remember, the purpose of him marrying this woman is to basically bring an occasion against the Philistines. And so we kind of see that Samson's the one that's provoking this. He wants to put forth a riddle, and here's the stipulations to the riddle. If you can get this riddle, it says, "If you can certainly declare it me within the 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I will give you 30 sheets and 30 change of raiment, of garments." So basically, and think about that. Why is it 30? Well, it's the 30 companions that are with him. Right? So basically, these 30 companions of the Philistines that are coming to him, he's basically saying, hey, I'm going to put forth a riddle to you, and if you get this, I'm going to basically give you 30 sheets, 30 pieces, 30 change of garments. And verse, which I believe is meaning like each one of them is going to get that. Okay? But in verse 13 there, it says, "But if ye cannot declare it me, then shall ye give me 30 sheets and 30 change of garments. And they said unto him, Put forth thy riddle, that we may hear it." So it's kind of like this bet, right? It's like, well, if you can get it, I'll give you this. If you don't get it, you have to give it to me, right? And in verse 14, "And he said unto them, Out of the eater came forth meat, and out of the strong came forth sweetness. And they could not in 3 days expound the riddle." It's interesting because this is almost set up like a Jeopardy question, which is like they give the statement, you have to answer it in a question because the answer is a question, okay? But out of the eater came forth meat, and out of the strong came forth sweetness. Now, since we're reading the story, we know what he's talking about. But could you imagine if you didn't know what happened there, what in the world he's talking about? Imagine you didn't read that part where there's this lion, he comes back, there's honey found in the carcass. You would be like, what in the world is that even talk? So you can imagine that they are not going to know it. Verse 15, it says, "And it came to pass on the 7th day that they said unto Samson's wife, Entice thy husband, that he may declare unto us the riddle, lest we burn thee and thy father's house with fire. Have ye called us to take that we have? Is it not so? And Samson's wife wept before him. So, man, that's quite a statement. Be like, you guys are real pals. It's like if you don't get your husband to tell me this riddle, then I'm going to kill you and your father with fire. So, and Samson's wife wept before him and said, "Thou dost but hate me and lovest me not." This is kind of like a foreshadowing of Delilah. Okay, the famous Samson and Delilah story is just constantly that she's just like, you don't love me, you don't really love me. And so basically his wife here is doing this to him. You know, you hate me and lovest me not. Thou hast put forth a riddle unto the children of my people, and hast not told it me. And he said unto her, Behold, I have not told it my father nor my mother, and shall I tell it thee? And she wept before him the 7 days, while their feast lasted. And it came to pass on the seventh day that he told her, because she lay sore upon him, and she told the riddle to the children of her people. So this just shows you that even Samson, as strong as he is, can't take his wife nagging him for 7 days about this riddle. So the idea here is that it's clear what's going to happen. I don't know if anybody's ever read this story and just like shocked that she tells the people this riddle. But the response of Samson is both hilarious and also just kind of obviously bad for them. Because in verse 18, it says, Then the men of the city said unto him, On the seventh day, before the sun went down, it says, What is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion? And that's what he says here. He said unto them, now this is definitely colloquial, idioms of the day, because I don't know who says this, but it's hilarious. But it says, If ye had not plowed with my heifer, ye had not found out my riddle. And this is just one of those things where I believe that this is, translated, the way it's supposed to be, but the idea there is that the language that they would use as far as like his heifer meaning his wife, and obviously they lay sore on her to basically get him to tell the riddle. And so verse 19, it says, And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon, which is in the Philistine area, and slew 30 men of them, and took their spoil, and gave change of raiments unto them, which expounded the riddle. And his anger was kindled, and he went up to his father's house. So, what's worse, you having to go pay for these garments, or letting 30 men that you probably know die to give you those raiments? So basically he's like, I'll give you your raiment, and he took it off the backs of 30 people that he kills. And so this is light compared to what Samson's going to do to the Philistines in the next chapter, as far as how many he kills. He kills thousands of Philistines by himself. So 30 is kind of like the warm-up here when it comes to this. And so he goes up back to his father's house. He's angry, obviously. And it says in verse 20, But Samson's wife was given to his companion whom he had used as a friend. And I know I just preached on this because I was preaching about friendship, but the idea of these weren't really Samson's friends, right? I mean, these companions that were given to him or brought to him, they weren't really his friends. He was just kind of using them as a friend. Like I said, I don't know if it was like a wedding party thing, and it was just like, I'm just using you as my wedding party. I don't know exactly what's going on there with that. But I want to go into chapter 15 here, because the story doesn't end with the wife until chapter 15. So he goes up, and then the wife is given to his companion. Now, he doesn't know this, because then in chapter 15, verse 1, it says, But it came to pass within a while after, in the time of wheat harvest. So we're talking a little while that's going on here, that it's not like he just went up one night, comes back a couple days, and be like, all right, I've cooled down. Where's my wife at? We're talking probably a season has passed here. And it says that Samson visited his wife with a kid. Now, a kid meaning a goat. I know I have to keep saying this, but he didn't just find a child on the street and be like, hey, I got a present for you. Obviously, a goat, like a baby goat type of thing, right? That's what every newlywed wants, right? A baby goat. Or maybe it's a baby cow. right? That's usually what I see nowadays is the cows. But it says with a kid, and he said, I will go into my wife into the chamber, but her father would not suffer him to go in. Why? Because he gave her away to another man. Verse 2 there, it says, and her father said, I verily thought that thou hadst utterly hated her. Therefore I gave her to thy companion. Is not her younger sister fairer than she? Take her, I pray thee, instead of her. And it says, and Samson said concerning them, now shall I be more blameless than the Philistines, though I do them a displeasure. And Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took the firebrands. This is a very interesting story. First of all, I want you to think about this. Imagine catching 300 foxes, first of all. I mean, I've seen foxes, but it's usually like here and there. I mean, they're pretty hard to find. So the first kind of miracle in this whole story is where were these foxes at and why are there so many? You know, it's kind of like the badger skins in the wilderness. Like, man, there was an influx of badgers that were going on there. I know we were kind of talking about that before, but the foxes were just out of control here in the Philistine area, apparently. He caught 300 foxes. Now, what does he do here with these foxes? So in this whole story here, the big thing that I would think of is the fact that he kills this lion, but also that he takes these foxes. First of all, he catches 300 foxes, which is crazy in itself, and took firebrands and turned tail to tail and put a firebrand in the midst between two tails. So basically what he would do is, they're even numbers, so this would be 15 different cases where he's doing this. I just want to see this happen. I want to see how he does it, right? Does he tie up the foxes? Is he like holding a fox in each arm? And he's just like holding them and he's like tying their tails together. But essentially, he's tying the tails together and he's putting a firebrand that's tying them together and he's lighting that on fire. Because then what happens here in verse 5, it says, and when he had set the brands on fire, he let them go into the standing corn of the Philistines and burned up both the shocks and also the standing corn with the vineyards and olives. He basically destroys all their crops with these foxes. So it's just an interesting thing. One, finding these foxes. Two, tying their tails together with, I mean, this is a feat. I just wonder how long it took. But the idea here is that he sends these foxes out, and I imagine that these foxes didn't like this because they're setting their tails on fire, okay? But essentially, the brands are on fire. It's eventually going to get to their tail, but you can imagine what's going on here. That you say, why doesn't he just put the firebrand on one end of the one tail of the fox? I believe what's going on here is that he's basically putting like there's two foxes, and then there's a firebrand that's attached to that. When they run, that firebrand is being forced to basically go over the corn or over the field, right? Because you imagine if you let their tail on fire and you just let them run, they probably run between the rows and stuff like that. This makes it to where that fire is being forced to run over top of the crops. Okay, so I believe that's what's going on there. They're obviously not running in both directions because that wouldn't work. Okay, so basically they're running together, but they're kind of like probably just, you know, and then that firebrand is basically going over the crops between them, and it's catching everything on fire. So the Philistines weren't happy about this. So it says in verse 6 here, it says, then the Philistines said, who had done this? And they answered, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he had taken his wife and given her to his companion. And the Philistines came up and burnt her and her father with fire. So they threatened that when it came to the riddle, they actually did it. So they actually killed his wife and his father-in-law because of what Samson did. In verse 7 there it says, and Samson said unto them, though ye have done this, yet will I be avenged of you, and after that I will cease. And he smote them hip and thigh with a great slaughter, and he went down and dwelt in the top of the rock Edom. And that will bring you into the next story in chapter 15, which is a really cool story. So I'm not going to get into that tonight, but I wanted to talk about his marriage. Now, this ends poorly, right? Samson's story is very much a tragic story. You know, Samson, it's cool because he's strong and he's ripping lions in half. You know, he's catching 30 foxes. Like, he's doing all this crazy stuff. Later on, he's going to be taking, like, the whole gate bar and all on his back and just runs up the hill with it. You know, it's just like, this guy is a beast. And as a man, you look at it and be like, that's a cool character right there. But man, is it a tragic story when it comes to what happens to him and what he goes through. And this is a great story of, you know, when it comes to Samson, of not giving your strength on the women. Samson is not infallible in these passages as far as what he does, especially when you're dealing with Delilah and all that, as far as what happens with him in the end. And it is a tragic story, but it's one that's relatable. It's one that you can look at and be like, I get him being angry. I get all of this. But it's just crazy stuff. And the foxes are always interesting to me. And I'm sure there's a lot more spiritual applications you can make to this when it comes to the foxes and the firebrands and everything else. But in the end, I'm going through this because, one, you should just know this story and just think about this story with Samson and know, hey, it's not just Samson and Delilah, though that is, you know, a part of the story. But he actually had a wife before that, and that marriage didn't last long. She ends up getting killed by her own people, and Samson is starting to really take it out on the Philistines. And this is just a beginning to him taking out the Philistines. And so he judges Israel for a while during this period. And out of all the judges, I mean, you have Gideon, the sword of the Lord of Gideon, but you think of Samson, right? If anybody's thinking about the judges, you're thinking of Gideon, you're thinking of Samson, and anybody that lifts weights or goes to the gym, they're like, Samson, he's my man, right? But I don't think anybody really would want would be like, I wish I had Samson's life, right? And so it's a very tragic story in the end. But let's end with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. Thank you for your word. Thank you for these passages. Thank you for these stories. And obviously, help us to learn from them and to apply them to our lives. The Lord, just interesting, cool stories and just adventures as far as dealing with Samson and killing a lion, dealing with the foxes and just how he dealt with the Philistines, Lord. And Lord, help us to understand it. Help us to apply it. And Lord, thank you for the salvations this week. And just pray that you'd be with us throughout the rest of this week. And Lord, we love you. Pray also in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.